In the grand theater of human experience, some of the most profound lessons are delivered not in classrooms or lecture halls, but in the most unexpected places by the most unlikely teachers. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, has become one such place where wisdom flows as freely as justice, where life-changing insights emerge from the simplest interactions, and where a routine legal proceeding can transform into a masterclass in living. What happened on a rainy Thursday morning would prove that sometimes the most powerful education comes not from what we're taught, but from what we're shown about ourselves. The man who was about to receive one of the most unexpected life lessons ever delivered from a judge's bench was 34-year-old Marcus Thompson, a single father whose world had been turned upside down 18 months earlier when his wife Sarah died in a car accident. In an instant, Marcus went from being half of a parenting team to being solely responsible for raising their twin 7-year-old daughters, Emma and Sophie. The transition from married father to widowed single dad had been more devastating than any challenge he had ever faced, and the ripple effects of that tragedy were still reshaping every aspect of his existence. Marcus had always prided himself on being a responsible man. Before Sarah's death, he had worked as a mid-level manager at a logistics company, earning a steady salary that, combined with Sarah's income as a nurse, had provided their family with a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. They had a modest house in a good neighborhood, reliable cars, and most importantly, they had each other. Marcus was the kind of father who never missed a school play, who coached Little League on weekends, who read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. He thought he had fatherhood figured out. But everything he thought he knew about being a parent crumbled the night 2 police officers knocked on his door to tell him that Sarah had been killed by a drunk driver on her way home from a late shift at the hospital. In that moment, Marcus didn't just lose his wife and best friend. He lost his co-parent, his emotional support system, his financial partner, and his sense of certainty about the future. The twins, who had been sleeping peacefully upstairs, woke up the next morning to a world that would never be the same. The first months after Sarah's death were a blur of funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, and the overwhelming task of learning to be a single parent while drowning in his own grief. Marcus discovered that all the parenting skills he had developed over 7 years were only half of what was needed. He had been the fun dad, the one who played games and told jokes, while Sarah had been the organizer, the scheduler, the one who remembered doctor's appointments and school deadlines. Without her, Marcus felt like he was trying to parent with one hand tied behind his back. Work became increasingly difficult to manage alongside his new responsibilities. The twins needed him more than ever. They were struggling with their own grief, acting out in school, having nightmares, and requiring a level of attention and emotional support that Marcus felt ill-equipped to provide. He started missing important meetings to handle school emergencies, leaving work early for parent-teacher conferences, and showing up late because mornings had become battles over everything from breakfast choices to matching socks. His supervisor, initially sympathetic, grew less understanding as Marcus's work performance suffered. The company had deadlines to meet, clients to satisfy, and profits to maintain. Compassion, while appreciated, didn't extend indefinitely in the corporate world. When Marcus was passed over for a promotion he had been expecting, then saw his hours reduced, then eventually found himself laid off during a company restructuring, the pattern seemed cruel but predictable. In a world designed for 2-parent households or single people without dependents, Marcus felt like he was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The financial pressures mounted quickly. Sarah's life insurance helped with immediate expenses, but it wasn't enough to replace 2 incomes indefinitely. The mortgage payments, childcare costs, medical bills, and basic living expenses created a monthly deficit that grew larger each month. Marcus took a job at a local restaurant, working nights and weekends while the girls stayed with Sarah's mother. The pay was a fraction of what he had earned before, but it was flexible work that allowed him to be present for the girls during most of their waking hours. But being present and being the parent they needed were 2 different things. Marcus found himself constantly exhausted, emotionally drained, and increasingly short-tempered with the twins when they acted like normal 7-year-olds. He felt guilty for snapping at them, guilty for working when he should be with them, guilty for not being able to provide them with the life Sarah would have wanted them to have. Most of all, he felt guilty for feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising the 2 people he loved most in the world. The parking ticket that brought Marcus to Judge Caprio's courtroom seemed like a minor addition to his mountain of problems, but even minor problems felt enormous when you were already at your breaking point. He had been rushing to pick up the girls from school after a morning doctor's appointment. Emma had been complaining of stomach aches that turned out to be anxiety-related, and had parked in a 15-minute zone outside the school. What should have been a quick pickup turned into a 20-minute conversation with Emma's teacher about her declining grades and increasing behavioral problems. When Marcus returned to his car, the bright orange parking ticket tucked under his windshield wiper felt like the universe's way of reminding him that he couldn't seem to do anything right anymore. $40 might not sound like much to some people, but for Marcus, it represented groceries for 2 days or gas money to get to work. More than the financial impact, though, the ticket represented another failure in his long list of things he couldn't manage properly. Standing in Judge Caprio's courtroom that Thursday morning, Marcus felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Around him sat other defendants, most of whom seemed confident and prepared to argue their cases or simply pay their fines and move on. Marcus had no argument to make, no excuse that seemed valid, no story that felt worth telling. He was just a man who had parked illegally because he couldn't manage to get his life organized well enough to find legal parking while dealing with his daughter's problems. He was ready to pay the fine, accept another small defeat, and add this humiliation to the growing list of ways he was failing as a father. The morning of Marcus's court appearance had started like most of his mornings in the past 18 months, with chaos barely contained by caffeine and determination. Emma had woken up crying from another nightmare about her mother, while Sophie had decided she would only wear her favorite purple dress, which was still in the laundry basket dirty from the previous day. Marcus found himself negotiating with a 7-year-old about clothing choices while simultaneously trying to comfort another 7-year-old who was reliving trauma in her sleep, all while brewing coffee and packing lunches and checking homework that he had helped with the night before but somehow still felt unprepared. By the time he dropped the girls off at school, Marcus was already running late for his court appearance. He had taken the morning off from his restaurant job, which meant losing wages he couldn't afford to lose, to deal with a parking ticket he couldn't afford to pay. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was spending money he didn't have on time he couldn't spare to address a fine that existed because he hadn't had enough time to find proper parking while dealing with problems he felt unequipped to handle. It was the kind of circular logic that had come to define his life since Sarah's death. The drive to the courthouse gave Marcus time to think about how dramatically his life had changed, and not for the better. Before Sarah died, he had been the kind of man who had plans, goals, and a sense of control over his destiny. He had imagined their future together, watching the girls grow up, celebrating graduations and weddings, eventually becoming grandparents together. He had pictured himself as the dad who would teach his daughters to drive, who would intimidate their first boyfriends, who would walk them down the aisle someday with Sarah beaming in the front row. Now, Marcus struggled to plan beyond the next day. His goals had shrunk from dreams of the future to hopes of simply making it through each 24-hour period without any major disasters. Control had become an illusion. He felt like he was constantly reacting to crises rather than preventing them, always one step behind the demands of single parenthood, perpetually exhausted and overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than he could address them. The twins, despite being only 7, seemed to sense his struggles, which made everything worse. Emma had become clingy and anxious, constantly worried that something would happen to Marcus too. She would have meltdowns when he was even 5 minutes late picking her up from school, convinced that he had been in an accident like Mommy. Sophie had gone in the opposite direction, becoming defiant and testing boundaries that Marcus felt too tired to consistently enforce. She would refuse to clean her room, talk back when corrected, and push limits that Sarah would have handled with a combination of firmness and understanding that Marcus couldn't seem to replicate. Both girls were struggling in school, their grades dropping and their behavior reports becoming increasingly concerning. Emma's teacher had started requesting regular conferences to discuss her anxiety and inability to focus on schoolwork. Sophie's teacher was dealing with disruptions and defiance that were completely out of character for the sweet, compliant child she had been before her mother's death. Marcus felt like he was failing them in every possible way, as their protector, their provider, their emotional support system, and their guide through their own grief. The financial pressures added another layer of stress to every decision Marcus made. The restaurant job barely covered their basic expenses, and there was no room in the budget for extras that other kids took for granted. Birthday parties became sources of anxiety because Marcus couldn't afford gifts that seemed appropriate. School fundraisers and field trips required creative budgeting that often meant sacrificing something else important. The girls needed new clothes as they grew, school supplies, birthday presents for friends' parties, and dozens of other small expenses that added up to overwhelming financial pressure. Marcus had considered moving to a smaller apartment or a less expensive neighborhood, but the girls had already lost their mother. He couldn't bear the thought of taking away their home, their school, their friends too. He was determined to maintain as much stability as possible in their lives, even if it meant sacrificing his own financial security and peace of mind. But the cost of that stability was eating away at him, day by day, bill by bill. The parking ticket incident had occurred during one of Emma's worst anxiety episodes at school. She had been in the nurse's office, crying inconsolably and asking for her mother, unable to calm down enough to return to class. Marcus had rushed from work, heart pounding with a familiar fear that something was seriously wrong, only to find his daughter overwhelmed by the same grief and confusion that he carried every day. He had held her for 20 minutes, rocking her gently and whispering the same reassurances he gave her every night, that he loved her, that he wasn't going anywhere, that they would figure everything out together. When they finally walked to the car, Emma's hand small and warm in his, Marcus had felt the complicated mixture of love and inadequacy that had become his constant companion. He loved his daughters more than life itself, would do anything to protect them and provide for them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they deserved better than what he was able to give them. They deserved their mother. They deserved financial security. They deserved a father who had answers instead of just more questions. The parking ticket tucked under his windshield wiper had felt like a symbol of everything he was doing wrong. Another rule broken, another fine to pay, another example of his inability to manage the basic logistics of life. As he sat in the courthouse waiting area, Marcus wondered how other single parents managed to make it look so easy. He saw them at school events and soccer games, seemingly confident and in control, their children happy and well-adjusted. What was wrong with him that he couldn't figure out what they had mastered? The truth was that Marcus had been measuring himself against an impossible standard, the memory of who he had been when he had Sarah beside him, when parenting was a shared responsibility, when love and support flowed both ways in their relationship. He was trying to be both parents to the girls while dealing with his own grief and trauma, working a job he hated to pay bills he could barely afford, all while maintaining a facade of strength for daughters who needed him to be their rock even when he felt like he was crumbling inside. When Marcus Thompson's name was called, he stood up with the resigned posture of a man who had grown accustomed to disappointment. He approached Judge Caprio's bench expecting nothing more than a routine fine, a brief interaction that would add to his financial burden and send him back to his already overwhelming day. What he didn't expect was the way Judge Caprio looked at him, not with the detached professionalism of a bureaucrat processing cases, but with the keen attention of someone who saw beyond the surface. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio said, glancing down at the paperwork before looking back up with those perceptive eyes that had made him beloved by millions. "I see you're here about a parking violation at Roosevelt Elementary School. Tell me what happened that day." The question was simple enough, but something in the judge's tone suggested he was interested in more than just the basic facts of the citation. Marcus cleared his throat, suddenly feeling more nervous than he had expected. "Your Honor, I was picking up my daughter from school. She was in the nurse's office having a difficult day, and I stayed with her longer than I had planned. When I came back to the car, there was a ticket. I know I was parked illegally, and I take full responsibility for that." He had rehearsed these words during the drive to the courthouse, determined to keep his explanation brief and factual. But Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from professional interest to something that looked almost like concern. "Your daughter was having a difficult day? What kind of difficult day, if you don't mind me asking?" The judge's voice carried a gentleness that Marcus hadn't expected, and something about that kindness cracked the carefully constructed wall he had built around his emotions. She gets anxious sometimes," Marcus said, his voice catching slightly. "Emma is 7, and she lost her mother 18 months ago. Some days are harder than others, and that day she was missing her mom really badly. She couldn't stop crying, and I couldn't just leave her like that." As he spoke, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he talked about Sarah's death and its impact on the girls. The courtroom, which had been filled with the usual low murmur of conversation and shuffling papers, grew noticeably quieter. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, studying Marcus with an expression that had shifted from professional to deeply personal. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Thompson. Losing a parent is devastating for any child, but losing a spouse when you have young children. I can't imagine how difficult that must be for all of you." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. He had become expert at having these conversations, the careful dance of acknowledging sympathy while not falling apart in public, of being grateful for kindness while maintaining the composure that everyone seemed to expect from him. But something about Judge Caprio's presence made it harder to maintain that emotional distance. "Tell me about Emma and, do you have other children?" the judge asked, and Marcus was surprised by how much he wanted to answer, how much he wanted someone to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. "Emma has a twin sister, Sophie. They're both 7, and they're both struggling in different ways. Emma gets anxious and clingy, afraid something will happen to me too. Sophie acts out and pushes boundaries. They're both having problems in school, and I don't always know how to help them." The admission felt like a confession, acknowledging out loud what he had been trying to deny to himself. Judge Caprio nodded thoughtfully. "And you're raising them alone?" When Marcus confirmed this, the judge continued, "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Thompson?" "I work at a restaurant, Your Honor. Nights and weekends mostly, so I can be with the girls during the day. It's not what I used to do, but it gives me flexibility for things like school emergencies." Marcus felt himself explaining more than he had intended, but Judge Caprio's questions seemed to invite honesty rather than mere legal compliance. "What did you used to do?" the judge asked, and Marcus was struck by how this simple question opened up a flood of emotions about the life he used to have, the man he used to be. "I was a logistics manager at a distribution company. Good salary, benefits, regular hours. But after Sarah died, I couldn't manage the demands of that job and taking care of the girls. I kept missing meetings, leaving early for school issues, coming in late because mornings became so complicated. Eventually, they laid me off during a restructuring, and I took the restaurant job because I needed something more flexible." As he spoke, Marcus realized he had never told this story in its entirety to anyone, had never laid out the full sequence of losses and compromises that had brought him to this point. Judge Caprio listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, but mostly just giving Marcus space to tell his story. It was a luxury Marcus hadn't experienced in months. Having someone's full attention, being heard without judgment, feeling like his struggles mattered to another human being. "So on the day of this parking violation," Judge Caprio said finally, "you were rushing from your restaurant job to deal with a crisis at your daughter's school, and you made a quick decision to park illegally so you could get to Emma faster. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. I know it doesn't excuse breaking the parking rules, but yes, that's what happened." Marcus braced himself for the lecture about responsibility and following laws regardless of circumstances, the kind of response he had grown accustomed to from other authority figures in his life. Instead, Judge Caprio did something unexpected. He smiled, not the professional smile of someone going through the motions, but the warm, genuine smile of someone who had just heard something that moved him. "Mr. Thompson, let me ask you something. Do you think you're a good father?" The question caught Marcus completely off guard. In all his preparations for this court appearance, he had never expected to be asked to evaluate his own parenting. I try to be, Your Honor. I love my daughters more than anything, but I feel like I'm failing them most of the time. I can't give them everything they need, I can't replace their mother, I can't even manage to park legally when they need me." The honesty in his answer surprised even him. Judge Caprio's response to Marcus's self-doubt was not what anyone in the courtroom expected, least of all Marcus himself. The judge stood up from his bench, something he rarely did during proceedings, and looked directly at Marcus with an intensity that commanded the attention of everyone present. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of wisdom and the passion of someone who had just witnessed a profound injustice. Not a legal one, but a personal one. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio began, his voice rising with emotion, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might be the most important thing anyone has ever said to you." The courtroom fell completely silent, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. "You just told me that you feel like you're failing your daughters. You said you can't give them everything they need, can't replace their mother, can't even manage to park legally. But let me tell you what I heard in your story." The judge began to pace slightly behind his bench, his judicial robes flowing as he moved, his hands gesturing with the passion of someone delivering a sermon rather than a legal judgment. "I heard about a man who gave up a successful career, gave up financial security, professional status, and personal comfort, so that he could be present for his children during their darkest time. I heard about a father who works nights and weekends at a job beneath his qualifications so that he can be available when his daughters need him during the day." Marcus stood frozen, his eyes beginning to well up with tears as he listened to Judge Caprio describe his choices in terms he had never considered before. Around the courtroom, other defendants, court officers, and spectators were equally riveted by what was unfolding before them. "I heard about a man who rushed from work to hold his 7-year-old daughter while she cried for her mother, who stayed with her for 20 minutes. 20 minutes that he knew would cost him money he couldn't afford, because her emotional needs were more important to him than a parking ticket." Judge Caprio's voice was growing stronger, more passionate with each word. "Mr. Thompson, do you know what that makes you? That makes you exactly the kind of father every child deserves to have." The tears Marcus had been fighting finally broke free, streaming down his cheeks as he heard his struggles reframed not as failures, but as sacrifices. For 18 months, he had been measuring himself against an impossible standard, convinced that his inability to be everything to everyone meant he was failing as a parent. But Judge Caprio was showing him a different perspective, one that transformed his story from a tale of inadequacy into one of heroic love. "You think you can't give your daughters everything they need?" Judge Caprio continued, his voice now filled with the kind of righteous indignation that came from witnessing someone's inability to see their own worth. "Let me tell you what you're giving them. You're giving them a father who puts their needs above his own comfort. You're giving them a man who shows up, day after day, even when he's exhausted and overwhelmed. You're giving them an example of what real love looks like. Not the easy love that flows when everything is going well, but the hard love that persists through tragedy and hardship." The judge paused, allowing his words to sink in, not just for Marcus but for everyone in the courtroom who was witnessing this extraordinary moment. "Mr. Thompson, your daughters don't need you to be perfect. They don't need you to replace their mother or give them everything money can buy. They need you to be exactly what you already are, a father who loves them enough to sacrifice everything for their well-being." Marcus was openly crying now, and he wasn't alone. Court officers who had heard thousands of cases were wiping away tears, and spectators were reaching for tissues as they watched this powerful moment of recognition unfold. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with his life lesson. "And let me tell you something else," the judge said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone but still carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "The fact that you worry about whether you're a good father, the fact that you question your decisions and constantly try to do better, that's not a sign of failure. That's a sign of love. Bad fathers don't lose sleep worrying about whether they're doing enough. Bad fathers don't give up careers to be present for their children. Bad fathers don't rush from work to hold crying daughters in school nurse offices." The judge returned to his seat, but continued speaking with the same passion. "You told me you can't even manage to park legally when your daughters need you. But here's what I see. I see a father whose love for his children is so strong that when faced with a choice between following parking rules and being there for his daughter in crisis, he chose love. Every time. And he'll continue to choose love, even when it costs him, even when it's difficult, even when the world doesn't understand." Judge Caprio leaned forward, looking directly into Marcus's eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not just going to dismiss this parking ticket. I'm going to do something more important than that. I'm going to give you a homework assignment, and it's more important than any fine or penalty I could impose." The courtroom waited in rapt attention for what the judge would say next. "I want you to go home tonight and look at your daughters, really look at them. I want you to see them through the eyes of a man who understands his own worth. I want you to see that they're not damaged by having a father who struggles sometimes. They're blessed to have a father who struggles for them. I want you to understand that the sacrifices you've made, the career you gave up, the financial security you lost, all of that isn't evidence of failure. It's evidence of the kind of love that builds strong human beings. The judge's voice grew softer but no less powerful. And I want you to know that 18 months from now, when your daughters are older and stronger, they won't remember that you couldn't afford expensive toys or that you sometimes parked illegally. They'll remember that their father was there when they needed him. They'll remember that he held them when they cried, that he chose them over everything else, that he loved them enough to rebuild his entire life around their needs. Marcus could barely speak through his tears, but he managed to whisper, "Thank you, Your Honor. I needed to hear that." Judge Caprio smiled, and it was a smile filled with warmth and understanding. "Mr. Thompson, sometimes we need someone else to hold up a mirror and show us who we really are. You're not a failure. You're a hero. And your daughters are lucky to have you." Hashtag Judge Caprio's life lesson to a single dad, Block 5. The transformation in Marcus Thompson didn't happen overnight, but it began the moment he walked out of Judge Caprio's courtroom carrying something far more valuable than a dismissed parking ticket. He carried with him a completely new understanding of his own worth as a father, a reframing of his entire story that would change not just how he saw himself, but how he approached every challenge that lay ahead. For the first time in 18 months, Marcus felt like he might actually be enough for his daughters, not despite his struggles, but because of how he had chosen to handle them. The drive to pick up Emma and Sophie from school that afternoon was unlike any drive Marcus had taken in recent memory. Instead of his usual internal dialogue of self-criticism and worry, he found himself replaying Judge Caprio's words, seeing his own actions through the lens the judge had provided. The career change he had viewed as a failure became a sacrifice made out of love. The financial struggles he had seen as inadequacy became evidence of his priorities being in the right place. The exhaustion he felt every day became proof of how hard he was fighting for his daughter's well-being. When Marcus collected the girls from Roosevelt Elementary, something was fundamentally different in how he looked at them. He saw Emma's anxiety not as evidence of his failure to provide emotional stability, but as a normal response to trauma that she was working through with a father who would never stop showing up for her. He saw Sophie's occasional defiance not as disrespect for his authority, but as a 7-year-old's way of testing whether the one parent she had left would stick around no matter how difficult things became. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table working on homework, Emma looked up at him with those big, worried eyes that had become so familiar. "Daddy, are you okay? You seem different today." It was such a perceptive observation from a 7-year-old, and it made Marcus realize that children notice everything, including when their parents begin to heal. "You know what, sweetheart? I am different today," Marcus said, setting down his pen and giving both girls his full attention. "Today I learned something very important about our family, and I want to share it with you both." Sophie looked up from her math worksheet, curious about this shift in their father's usual evening routine. Marcus took a deep breath, thinking about how to translate Judge Caprio's profound lesson into language his daughters could understand. "Today I met a very wise judge who helped me understand that our family isn't broken, even though sometimes it feels that way. He helped me see that when I do things like rush from work to be with you when you're scared, or take a job that pays less money so I can spend more time with you, those aren't mistakes. Those are the things that good daddies do." The conversation that followed was the most honest one Marcus had had with his daughters since Sarah's death. He acknowledged that their life was different now, that money was tighter and schedules were more complicated, that sometimes he felt overwhelmed and didn't have all the answers. But he also helped them understand that none of that meant they were loved any less, or that their family was somehow deficient compared to others. "The judge told me that I'm exactly the daddy you need me to be," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "And you know what I realized? You're exactly the daughters I need too. We're learning how to be a family of 3 instead of 4, and that's hard work, but we're doing it together, and that makes us strong." Emma climbed into her father's lap, something she hadn't done in weeks. "I'm glad you're not sad anymore, Daddy." Sophie, not to be outdone, wrapped her arms around both of them from behind. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, The three of them sat together without the weight of unspoken grief and inadequacy crushing down on them. The video of Marcus's court appearance, like so many of Judge Caprio's most powerful moments, was shared widely online within hours of being posted. But this one resonated particularly strongly with single parents around the world who recognized their own struggles in Marcus's story. Comments poured in from fathers and mothers who had felt the same crushing sense of inadequacy, the same fear that they weren't enough for their children, the same guilt about the sacrifices their circumstances had forced them to make. Within days of the video going viral, Marcus found himself receiving offers of help from strangers who had been moved by his situation. A local business owner reached out to offer him a better-paying position with more regular hours. A child care center offered reduced rates for after-school care. A grief counselor who specialized in helping children process loss offered free sessions for Emma and Sophie. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus began connecting with other single parents who had reached out after seeing his story, discovering a support network he never knew existed. For the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus didn't feel like he was facing his challenges alone. He joined a support group for widowed parents, where he met other fathers and mothers who understood the unique grief that comes with losing a spouse while trying to hold a family together. He learned that the feelings he had been ashamed of, the anger, the overwhelming exhaustion, the moments of resentment at having to handle everything alone, were normal parts of the grieving process that every widowed parent experienced. 3 months after his court appearance, Marcus received a call from Judge Caprio's office, inviting him to bring the girls for a visit. When they arrived at the courthouse, the change in Marcus was immediately apparent to everyone who saw him. He stood straighter, smiled more easily, and spoke with a confidence that had been missing during their first encounter. Emma and Sophie were clearly thriving under their father's renewed sense of purpose and self-worth, chatting excitedly about school and friends as they walked through the courthouse halls. "Judge Caprio," Marcus said, shaking the older man's hand warmly as they met in his chambers, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did for me that day. You didn't just dismiss a parking ticket, you gave me back my sense of worth as a father." The judge smiled as he knelt down to meet Emma and Sophie at their level, immediately putting them at ease with his grandfatherly warmth. "And these must be the lucky little girls who have such a wonderful daddy," Judge Caprio said, his eyes twinkling as both girls beamed with pride. They had brought him pictures they had drawn. Emma's showed their family of 3 holding hands under a rainbow, while Sophie's depicted Judge Caprio sitting at his bench with a big smile and a heart above his head. As they talked about the changes in their lives over the past few months, Judge Caprio observed the transformation not just in Marcus, but in the girls as well. They were more relaxed, more confident, secure in the knowledge that their father saw his role not as a burden but as a privilege. "You know," the judge said to Marcus, "what I told you that day wasn't anything you didn't already know deep down. Sometimes we just need someone else to remind us of our own strength, our own worth. You were already a great father, you just needed to see it." Marcus's story became part of Judge Caprio's regular speaking engagements, a powerful example of how justice could be about more than punishment or even mercy. It could be about recognition, validation, and helping people see their own worth. The judge would often conclude these presentations by emphasizing that society's greatest need wasn't for perfect parents, but for devoted ones, not for families without struggles, but for families willing to face their struggles together with love and determination. The parking ticket that had brought Marcus to Judge Caprio's courtroom had seemed like just another problem in an already overwhelming life. But it had become the catalyst for a transformation that changed not just how Marcus saw himself, but how his daughters understood their family's strength. They learned that resilience wasn't about having no problems, but about facing problems with courage and love. They learned that their father's sacrifices weren't signs of failure, but evidence of the depth of his commitment to them. Years later, when Emma and Sophie were teenagers, they would often reference that day as the turning point when their family stopped seeing itself as broken and started understanding itself as beautifully resilient. They carried with them the lesson that Judge Caprio had taught their father, that love isn't measured by perfection, but by persistence, not by the absence of struggle, but by the willingness to keep fighting for what matters most. Marcus Thompson had walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom expecting to pay a fine and leave with another reminder of his inadequacy. Instead, he left with the most unexpected life lesson he had ever received, that he was already exactly the father his daughters needed him to be, and that recognition of his own worth was the foundation upon which he could build the strong, loving family they all deserved.